The late afternoon sunlight cast a warm, honeyed glow across the empty kitchen, filling it with a quiet calm that had always reminded me of home. My wife Jessica was still at work, and the kids were at their grandparents' for the weekend. We were supposed to have a rare, uninterrupted night together, a plan I'd made months ago. But there I was, holding 2 tickets to the Bahamas in my hand, ready to surprise her for our anniversary, feeling a strange, inexplicable heaviness in my chest. I was beginning to suspect something was wrong, though I didn't have a single reason why. I had just returned from a week-long business trip. Flying home early was a last-minute decision, and I'd intentionally kept it a secret, planning to catch her off guard. I wanted to see her smile when she saw me, wanted to believe that spark was still there between us. But as I walked through our front door, a sense of unease settled over me. Jessica's car was parked in the driveway, which wasn't unusual, but there was a second vehicle, sleek, black, and expensive, taking up the other side. I figured it might belong to one of her friends, or maybe she had called someone to fix something around the house. Still, something in the way the car gleamed, hidden partly behind the shade of our tree, made me feel uneasy. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. I noticed then that the blinds in the living room were pulled shut, a small but odd detail since Jessica loved natural light. Her habit of leaving the windows open had always annoyed me, and I'd teasingly call her a light fanatic. She'd laugh, saying that sunlight made everything seem brighter and warmer. Now, the closed blinds gave the room a slightly eerie quality. I climbed the stairs slowly, careful not to make a sound. As I reached the second floor, muffled laughter floated down the hallway. Jessica's laughter. It was a sound I hadn't heard in a while, warm, genuine, and intimate, a tone she hadn't used with me in what felt like months. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, each beat a hammer against my ribs. I had no idea what I was about to see, but a bitter taste had already crept into my mouth. Peeking around the corner of the slightly open bedroom door, my worst fears took shape. There, lying in our bed, Jessica was laughing with a man I didn't recognize. He was lounging beside her, shirtless, his hand lazily resting on her bare waist. I felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath me, and I was falling into a void with nothing to hold on to. This was the bed where we had made promises, shared dreams, and spoken of forever. And now, it was tainted. The tickets to the Bahamas crumpled in my hand, my grip tightening unconsciously. I wanted to burst in, to demand how she could do this to me, to our family, but I was frozen. Instead, I backed away, my movements as silent as they had been coming up. By the time I reached the kitchen, my legs felt like lead, barely able to carry my weight. The sunlight from the kitchen window no longer felt warm. It was harsh, exposing every fault line in my life. In the days that followed, I became a ghost haunting my own house, moving silently and watching Jessica carefully. She had no idea I'd seen anything. That much was clear. She greeted me each morning with the same empty smile, kissed my cheek absently, and went about her day as though everything was normal. For a while, I convinced myself I was in some kind of waking nightmare, that I'd walk into our room one night and find her as she had been on our honeymoon, smiling, genuinely happy, and in love with me. But each time she left for work, I'd feel the emptiness settle deeper in my bones. She was pulling away, and I had no idea how long she'd been drifting towards someone else. I couldn't stop replaying the memory of her laughter in our bed, her smile that night, the ease and intimacy she'd shared with that stranger. Desperate for answers, I took a risk. One night while she slept, I took her phone and cloned it onto a burner device. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I needed something concrete. It felt like stepping into a different world, seeing her texts and messages, some of them with his name, Robert. Most of the messages were mundane, "How's your day?" and "Let's grab lunch." But then came the messages that gutted me, words that spoke of secrets and stolen moments, of passions she hadn't shared with me in years. I realized that Robert had been in her life for longer than I could have imagined. I didn't know how to confront her yet. I needed time to process, to decide how to proceed. But the very next day, Jessica came home with a brightness I hadn't seen in a long time. She was practically glowing. "I've got news," she said, flashing me a smile that was all teeth. My company's promoting me. A new position. Better pay. Finally. I nodded, though inside, I was numb. This was her excuse, I realized. This would be her story if I confronted her. If I asked why she had been away more and more lately, she'd say it was her new role, that it had been consuming her time and energy. This was how she'd lie to me again and again, until I'd have no choice but to believe her. Weeks passed, and each day felt like walking through a storm with no end in sight. The cloned phone continued to fill with messages, each one a further confirmation of my suspicions. Jessica began coming home later, using her new promotion as the perfect excuse. Our conversations grew hollow, as if we were speaking through a wall. I noticed small things I'd ignored before. A new necklace, the faintest whiff of unfamiliar cologne clinging to her clothes. One night, after she'd come home late from work and gone straight to the shower, I finally found the courage to confront her. I waited until she'd stepped out of the bathroom, steam billowing around her. She looked startled to see me sitting on the edge of our bed, but she quickly composed herself. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She shifted uncomfortably. "Can it wait? I'm exhausted and—" "Who's Robert?" The question came out sharper than I intended. For a split second, her face paled, and I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But then she laughed, a light, airy sound that was as hollow as my heart. "Robert? He's a colleague. We've been working on the same project. Why would you even—" I cut her off. "I know, Jessica. I know about you and Robert. I know about the messages, the lunches, the everything." There was a silence that seemed to stretch on forever, and in that silence, I saw the last fragments of our marriage crumble. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain. She simply looked at me with a coldness that I'd never seen in her before, a coldness that told me she had left me behind a long time ago. And then, the final blow. "I never wanted this life," she whispered, almost to herself. "Not with you." After Jessica's admission, the house became a hollow shell, filled with tension and silence that wrapped around every conversation and interaction. Our kids were still away, so I had time to focus, to work out my next steps without distraction. Jessica moved through the days with an eerie calm. No apologies or attempts to fix what she had done. She was drifting further, and yet something in her detachment seemed to pulse with secrets still untold. On the surface, her actions seemed predictable. A wife finding escape in another man, tired of a husband she'd outgrown. But something about it didn't sit right. Jessica had always been good with money, a trait that balanced out my own tendency to be a little careless with spending. It was one of the things I'd appreciated about her in the beginning. But since her promotion, she'd taken a sudden interest in our finances, making suggestions about joint investments, consolidating accounts, things that, at the time, I thought were just part of her professional growth. Now I wondered if it had all been calculated. After our confrontation, I started watching her closely, tracking the odd behaviors I'd ignored before. She'd started dressing differently, more polished, professional, with pieces I hadn't seen before. And then there were the moments I'd catch her scrolling through her phone with a concentration that wasn't typical of her. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her betrayal than just another man. One evening, after she had gone out under the guise of a networking event, I logged into our bank accounts. Jessica handled most of our finances, so I didn't expect to find anything shocking. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, my stomach tightened. Over the last few months, several transfers had been made to accounts I didn't recognize, thousands of dollars siphoned out in small, unremarkable sums that were just enough to slip under the radar. I went further back, combing through records. The transfers had started just before her so-called promotion, and there was a pattern. Jessica was bleeding our accounts dry, bit by bit. I felt my pulse quicken, the sense of betrayal deepening as I pieced together her deception. She was building a nest egg somewhere, quietly and methodically, for months. Whatever her plan was, she had already set it in motion. I wasn't sure where to go from there. Confronting her had yielded nothing but cold indifference. I needed more information, a way to see what Jessica was really doing without alerting her. And then, an idea came to me. My old friend Neil from college had gone into IT and cybersecurity, and he'd been working for a private security firm. Over drinks one night a few years ago, he'd boasted about all the tricks of the trade that people use to spy on cheating spouses. At the time, it had sounded a bit paranoid, but now I needed those tricks. "Neil, it's been a while," I said when he answered, my voice shaking slightly. After some small talk, I told him the gist of what I was dealing with, careful to leave out certain details. "Let me guess, you want a tracking app for her phone," he said, barely hiding his amusement. "Yeah, and anything else you can think of. I think she's hiding money too." Neil paused, his tone turning serious. "I can help, but there are a few things you need to know. Surveillance isn't just about catching someone red-handed. You'll be opening up a can of worms, seeing things you might not want to see." "Already opened," I replied, unable to mask the bitterness in my voice. He set me up with a suite of tools, GPS trackers, apps that would log her messages and calls, and even a small device that could clone her laptop whenever she left it unattended. It felt invasive, but the man who cared about boundaries and respect had vanished the moment I'd seen her with Robert. That night, after Jessica had gone to bed, I installed the tracker on her phone and cloned her laptop. As I reviewed her browser history, I noticed she'd been searching for offshore accounts and high-yield investments. She'd been scouring forums and reading articles on financial independence, on strategies to prepare for a new beginning. I shuddered, realizing she was planning for a future without me. Days later, Neil's tools began yielding results. The GPS tracker showed Jessica's movements in real time, revealing a pattern I'd suspected but dreaded to confirm. She wasn't just meeting Robert occasionally. She was seeing him regularly, at an office that wasn't associated with her job. Suspicion twisted in my gut. I began researching the building she visited, discovering it housed several consulting firms, and one in particular caught my attention, a financial advisory firm with a specialty in high-asset divorce proceedings. It took all my restraint not to confront her that night. I had to play it smart, to wait until I had undeniable proof. Every evening, I watched her messages from the cloned phone, each one another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Their conversations were casual at times, playful at others, but a few messages were different. Robert would mention moving assets and avoiding potential liabilities. It was clear they weren't just involved romantically. They were partners in this plan to leave me blindsided and penniless. One afternoon, I took a calculated risk and set up a meeting with the manager of the bank where we kept our accounts. I presented myself as a concerned spouse, simply curious about some of our recent activity. But my inquiries were met with a polite stonewall, which only deepened my unease. Jessica had gone to lengths to secure whatever she was doing, covering her tracks with a skill that I couldn't reconcile with the woman I'd married. The next day, I decided it was time to pull Neil in further. He was hesitant at first. He'd helped friends through cheating before, but money laundering and financial fraud? This was new territory. But after I promised him a hefty bonus for his time, he agreed to help me dig deeper. After 2 days, Neil came back with a trove of information. Jessica's salary had been modest, yet she had managed to squirrel away over $100,000 in an account under a name I didn't recognize. Neil was thorough, tracing transactions to a secondary bank account that was connected to a series of offshore accounts. Armed with this new information, I knew my next move had to be perfect. I needed her to trust that I was still blissfully ignorant, but every interaction was torture. I smiled, I laughed, and even pretended to enjoy our last family dinner before she was set to leave on a business trip. I felt like an actor playing a part, waiting for my cue. The night before she left, I set my plan in motion. As she packed her bags, I casually suggested we review some finances, as I'd been considering a new investment strategy myself. She hesitated, eyes narrowing as if she sensed a trap, but she agreed. I kept the conversation light, steering away from anything that might alarm her. The next day, I took my kids to my parents' house, explaining that their mom would be away for a few days. As soon as they were safe, I made my way to Neil's office. Together, we began combing through Jessica's financial trails, finding more signs of her betrayal at every turn. When Neil looked up at me, his expression was grave. "She's been planning this a long time. You're not just dealing with an affair. This is fraud, my friend. She's systematically draining your assets." In that moment, Any remnants of love or loyalty I'd felt for Jessica disintegrated. This wasn't a simple betrayal. She was attempting to dismantle my life piece by piece, hoping I'd remain oblivious until it was too late. Jessica's business trip ended abruptly. Late that night, I got a call from Neil, his voice tense and urgent. She didn't go to the airport. The tracker shows she's checked into a nearby hotel. My stomach tightened. Was she planning to leave now? Pack her bags, drain the accounts, and vanish without a word? When I arrived at the hotel, I saw her car parked outside. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and entered the lobby. As I approached the room number Neil had given me, I felt every muscle tense with anticipation. Would I find her alone? Was Robert here, helping her finalize her plans? The door was ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed it open. There, sitting at the small hotel desk with her laptop open, was Jessica. She didn't notice me at first, focused intently on the screen, her phone lighting up with messages from Robert. She was too absorbed to see me step inside, too wrapped up in her plans to notice her husband watching her. And as I stood there, I realized that the betrayal was deeper than I'd ever imagined. The shock of seeing her sitting there, so calm, so confident in her deceit, froze me in place. My mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. Part of me wanted to storm in, demand answers, expose everything I knew. But as I watched her, a new realization settled over me. If I confronted her now, she would simply lie, twist the truth, and continue her betrayal in some other way. I couldn't let her win like that. This needed to be handled carefully. Instead, I backed out of the hotel room and left quietly, determined to find a way to turn her plans against her. Jessica thought she'd outsmarted me, that she had built an escape route from our marriage and from the financial ruin she was creating. But she didn't realize I was already several steps ahead of her. That night, I returned home and sat at the dining room table, piecing together my strategy. The next day, I called Neil again, explaining my decision to delay confronting Jessica until the perfect moment. He seemed skeptical, but he agreed to help me set up a more elaborate plan, one that would ensure Jessica couldn't weasel her way out when the truth finally came to light. Our first step was to trace every penny of our joint assets, to understand exactly where she was funneling money and how I could intercept it. Neil helped me set up a hidden surveillance system on her laptop and phone, monitoring her every transaction and communication with Robert. Over the next week, I watched Jessica's plan unfold in real time, observing her methods and learning her weaknesses. Each evening, she would send messages to Robert, updating him on her progress, discussing bank accounts and exit strategies. My anger burned hotter with every message, but I kept my composure, knowing that every detail was another thread I'd use to unravel her scheme. Through her messages, I discovered that Jessica had forged my signature on several financial documents, including a joint loan she had taken out in both our names. She had been using the funds from this loan to make her investments, siphoning money out while leaving me to pay the interest. It was clear she planned to leave me with the debt, ensuring that her financial future would be secure while mine would be left in ruins. My plan solidified over the following days. I would let her continue, watching as she drew up her plans, pretending to be oblivious until the exact moment when everything would come crashing down around her. But first, I needed to set my own trap. I started by hiring a financial investigator, someone separate from Neil, who could comb through our accounts with an outsider's perspective. Neil had helped immensely, but I needed a fresh pair of eyes on Jessica's schemes. If I could prove that she had forged my signature and was using my identity to siphon money, it would strengthen my case. I didn't just want a clean break from her. I wanted her to face consequences for what she'd done. This investigator, named Ellis, was efficient and discreet, someone I'd found through a referral. He agreed to meet under the guise of helping me with a business loan, which allowed me to avoid Jessica's suspicion. Ellis's investigation revealed yet another layer to Jessica's betrayal. She hadn't only been transferring funds to private accounts, she was also working with a small consulting firm to start a shell company in her name, one that would give her a cover for hiding assets offshore. The audacity of her plan struck me with fresh disgust. She wasn't just leaving me. She was attempting to erase any financial ties we shared, rebuilding her life under a fake name and identity. The next phase of my plan was psychological. If I was going to dismantle her scheme, I needed her to feel secure, so I acted as if nothing was amiss. Each morning, I went through our usual routines, pretending to be the husband she thought she had under control. I would tell her about business decisions I was considering, hinting that I'd be taking a bigger risk financially. She seemed interested, prodding me for more details. I could tell she was fishing for ways to siphon more money. To reinforce her confidence, I accidentally left some fake paperwork lying around the house. Documents suggesting I was investing in risky stocks and even a few false leads about bad debts I was supposedly racking up. Jessica took the bait. She seemed almost gleeful at the idea that I might be squandering our remaining money, as though it justified her own betrayal. One afternoon, while Jessica was at one of her business lunches with Robert, I slipped into her home office and found the flash drive where she kept encrypted files. I had long since learned her passcode, an anniversary date she thought I'd forgotten, and within minutes, I had access to everything. The drive contained detailed records of her plans with Robert, outlining how she would liquidate our assets, transfer them overseas, and then declare herself financially independent just before filing for divorce. With this flash drive, I finally had everything I needed, but I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. Instead, I made a copy of each file and began altering some of the documents. I inserted small discrepancies, changing bank account numbers, adding forged approval notes, and even creating a false trail of debts under Robert's name. If everything went according to plan, Jessica and Robert would fall into my trap, thinking they'd set up an impenetrable escape when in reality, they'd be left holding empty accounts and fabricated debts. I needed a finale, a moment where I could reveal everything and watch their world collapse. I decided to host an anniversary dinner for Jessica, telling her I wanted to reconnect. To my surprise, she agreed readily, probably thinking that this would be the perfect time to execute her final plan. I hired a private room at an upscale restaurant, one where I knew we'd have both privacy and a great view of the city, perfect for what I had in mind. The night of the dinner, Jessica arrived in a stunning dress, her demeanor bright and cheerful. She seemed genuinely excited, almost as if our relationship hadn't deteriorated beyond repair. I played along, acting the part of a doting husband who was blissfully unaware of her betrayal. We ordered drinks, and I watched as she relaxed, the ease in her body language a sign that she believed she'd won. Halfway through dinner, I pulled out a small gift box from my jacket pocket and slid it across the table to her. Jessica looked surprised, maybe a little suspicious, but she accepted it. Inside was a silver bracelet, one she'd admired years ago but never bought. She put it on, smiling as she admired the way it sparkled under the candlelight. "What's this for?" she asked, her voice softening. "For everything we've built together," I replied, my words carrying a weight she couldn't yet understand. "It's a token of appreciation. I wanted to thank you for being part of this life with me." She seemed flustered, perhaps realizing that she didn't quite deserve my gratitude, but she didn't question it further. Instead, she leaned in, placing her hand on mine, and for a moment, I almost believed that the woman I'd married was still there, buried somewhere beneath the deception. But the moment passed quickly, and I refocused on my plan. "You know, Jess, I've been thinking about making some big changes. I want us to invest in something together, something long-term." Her eyes lit up at the mention of an investment, and I could see her mind working. "What did you have in mind?" "Oh, I have a few ideas," I said, pausing dramatically. "In fact, I was thinking I could set up a joint fund for us, one where we each contribute equally. That way, everything's transparent. Full trust." She hesitated, her face flickering with something close to panic. Jessica had likely planned to siphon the last of our money into her offshore accounts soon, leaving nothing for me to contribute to any joint fund. But she recovered quickly, smiling as she nodded. "That sounds perfect." The rest of dinner passed smoothly, and by the end of it, Jessica seemed utterly convinced that her plan would go off without a hitch. I drove us home, watching her carefully in the rearview mirror as she leaned back, her expression serene. She had no idea that her entire scheme was about to unravel. 2 days later, I filed a motion with my attorney to freeze our joint accounts, citing evidence of fraud and forgery. My lawyer was sharp and discreet, and he moved swiftly, ensuring that the banks were notified and all suspicious transactions were flagged. Jessica wouldn't have access to a single cent without a thorough review of our financial history. As the final stroke, I called Robert from a disposable phone, posing as a bank official. In a voice that sounded suitably bureaucratic, I informed him that his accounts had been frozen and that his recent business transactions were under investigation for fraud. The following morning, I was sitting in my office, savoring a rare moment of peace, when I received a frantic call from Jessica. Her voice was shrill, panicked. "All our accounts have been frozen," she stammered. "They're saying there was unauthorized activity, something about fraudulent transfers." Feigning shock, I gasped. "Fraud? Jess, that sounds serious. Do you think? Could someone have hacked us?" Her silence was palpable, and for a brief, satisfying moment, I knew she understood the trap had snapped shut. Jessica's silence on the line was everything I'd hoped for. In that brief pause, her carefully constructed world crumbled, and I could almost hear her mind racing to piece together how her plan had unraveled. My heart pounded, fueled by months of betrayal, but I kept my voice calm, the perfect image of a concerned husband. "Maybe it's just some mix-up," I offered. "Why don't we meet with the bank together? Maybe they can help us figure out what's going on." She stammered a few words, then quickly agreed, the fear thick in her voice. She didn't know what else to say. This was supposed to be her victory, her final escape. Instead, she was trapped, just like she had planned for me. The next morning, I dressed for the occasion in a sharp, tailored suit, the kind I hadn't worn since we got married. I arrived at the bank a few minutes early and waited in the lobby, watching the seconds tick down until Jessica appeared. She walked in looking unnerved, her hair tied back in a tight ponytail and her face pale. She wore the same dress from our anniversary dinner, a desperate attempt to appear as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't betrayed me at all. The bank manager led us to a private room, the weight of tension filling the space between us. Jessica fidgeted with her bracelet, the one I'd given her during our anniversary dinner. It gleamed on her wrist like an ironic reminder of what she'd lost. As the manager took a seat, he glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its source. "Thank you both for coming in," he began, pulling up our account records. "There's been some irregular activity, and we need to verify these transactions with both of you." Jessica swallowed hard, her face betraying her nerves. She tried to cut in, her voice trembling as she attempted to explain. I've been handling our finances on my own for a while. Maybe there's just some misunderstanding." The manager nodded politely, waiting until she trailed off before turning the monitor to face me. I scanned the account details, pretending to read them for the first time, though I already knew every line by heart. Finally, I looked up at Jessica, feigning shock. "Jess, these are huge sums. I don't recognize any of these accounts." I turned to the manager, my voice cold. "Could you explain where exactly these funds have been transferred?" He nodded and pointed to the screen. Several transfers were made to accounts associated with a consulting firm and, more recently, to an offshore account. Jessica's face flushed. She stammered a few words, tripping over explanations as she tried to maintain her mask of innocence. I watched her carefully, letting her squirm for a moment, savoring the way her confidence shattered in real time. Then, finally, I leaned back in my chair and gave her a knowing smile, one that conveyed everything I'd uncovered. "Jessica," I said slowly, my voice low and deliberate, "I think it's time you told me everything." Her face went pale, the air thick with tension. She looked at me, a mixture of anger and fear brewing in her eyes. For the first time in years, the mask fell away, and I saw the real Jessica, a woman capable of deception, betrayal, and manipulation. "What's there to tell?" she spat, her voice bitter. "You know everything, don't you? I thought you were too blind to see, too wrapped up in your perfect little world." The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the turn the conversation had taken. He cleared his throat, mumbling something about giving us privacy, and quickly excused himself from the room. Once we were alone, I dropped all pretense, letting the fury I'd held back for months rise to the surface. "You've been bleeding our accounts dry," I said, voice cold and steady. "Planning your little escape with Robert. Hiding money offshore, faking signatures, taking out loans in my name. And for what? So you could start a new life without any consequences? She glared at me, eyes narrowed. I was tired of being invisible to you, of being trapped in this life. You think I wanted to do this? Don't you dare pretend this is my fault. I shook my head, unable to mask my disgust. You could have left. You could have had a real conversation, but instead, you chose to lie and steal. She smirked, a flicker of her old confidence returning. And what are you going to do now? Go to the police? Report me? Good luck proving anything. I've covered my tracks. I leaned forward, close enough to see her expression shift as she noticed the confidence in my own face. I don't need the police. I've already put everything in place. The accounts you siphoned funds into? I had them flagged last week. Every dollar has been traced back to you and Robert. For a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. I continued, driving the knife deeper. And as for your precious offshore accounts? I hired a private investigator who's already handed over all of your financial details to my lawyer. You'll have nothing, Jessica. Not a cent. No house. No car. Nothing. Her face fell, the realization settling in as her composure crumbled. You can't do this. You can't leave me with nothing, she hissed, desperation creeping into her voice. I smiled, savoring every moment of her fear. Oh, but I can. And I will. The divorce proceedings began shortly after our meeting at the bank. Armed with my lawyer and Neil's evidence, I had everything I needed to strip Jessica of any claims to our assets. The house, the cars, the investments, everything she had hoped to take with her would be mine. The court documents presented a detailed map of her schemes, from the forged signatures to the offshore accounts, leaving her defenseless in front of the judge. In her desperation, Jessica tried to manipulate the court, playing the role of the victim. She spun stories of feeling neglected, trapped, blaming her actions on a momentary lapse caused by my supposed emotional distance. But the evidence against her was ironclad, and the judge saw through her lies. The final blow came when my lawyer presented a statement from Robert's ex-wife. She had agreed to testify against Jessica, recounting her own experience with Robert's deception and his history of fraudulent schemes. It turned out Robert had tried this tactic before, convincing women to siphon money into offshore accounts under the guise of escaping their marriages. The judge ruled decisively, awarding me full ownership of our shared assets, while Jessica was left with nothing but legal fees and debt. After the final court date, I waited outside, watching as Jessica walked down the courthouse steps. She looked defeated, a shadow of the woman who had once thought she could betray me without consequence. Her eyes met mine briefly, filled with a venomous resentment, but there was nothing left she could say. As I walked away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Jessica's betrayal had cut deep, but I knew now that I'd come out stronger. She had gambled everything, assuming I would be too blind, too trusting, to notice. And in the end, she had lost it all. Months later, my life had taken on a new shape. I had moved to a new city, started fresh, investing in my own future with the assets I had fought to protect. The divorce had been brutal, but it was over, and I was finally free of her shadow. One afternoon, as I sat in a coffee shop, savoring the peace I had worked so hard to reclaim, I received a text from Neil. It was simple, just a single line. Thought you'd like to know. Jessica's working at a small diner, not far from her old office. I laughed, the bitterness long gone, replaced by a feeling of triumph. Jessica had chosen betrayal over honesty, manipulation over love, and now she was reaping the rewards of her decisions. I deleted the message, taking a long sip of my coffee. I had one, and for the first time in years, I felt a true sense of peace. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Tell us, what would you have done in their shoes?